Okay, welcome back to Searching for Reality. Or maybe reality searching for us. Okay, so I had a whole module that was supposed to be 1 week, but then it was just too much content, so I split it up in two. So I'm picking things up around slide 27 here. So we're talking about pre-Socratic philosophy. We're following the kind of the book here, which is Sophie's World. Do I have a copy? I thought I had a copy in my office somewhere. I should have probably brought it down before I hit the live stream button. I have a copy somewhere. And we're talking about the pre-Socratic natural philosophers. These pre-Socratic philosophers were interested in really deep metaphysical and ontological questions about the world, about the universe, what exists, what accounts for change in things that exist, on issues about the reliability of perception, and on the uses of reason. And it wasn't until Plato, Socrates, Aristotle that you had some more concerns with political philosophy, ethics, and so on. So we're deep in early metaphysics right now. So, and the basic problem for the Greeks was dealing with the problem of change in substances. The world is a pretty dynamic place. You know, water can evaporate, fire turns wood to ash, creatures cease living, bodies decompose, right? So why is there change? How does it occur? Now, as Sophie's World points out, this focus is a little bit different than those of thinkers over in kind of the Fertile Crescent, Babylonian Jewish thought, which mostly deals with the origins of the universe. But the Greeks kind of believe the universe has always existed. It's indefinitely in time in the past and indefinitely existing time in the future, perhaps infinitely in both directions. So the origin of existence is not a problem. What we need is an account of the forces and dynamics of the world that exist to account for change. So Thales of Miletus, we saw last week, had a very kind of proto-scientific empirical approach. He said everything is water, the basic substance of things is water, then it changes forms, right? It evaporates, it condenses, it freezes, it's in everything. So water is the fundamental substance. Heraclitus and Parmenides, later thinkers, not that much later, have more abstract approaches. Sometimes people simplify by saying, whereas Thales of Miletus said everything was water, Heraclitus said everything was fire. But fire for Heraclitus is a metaphor. Fire is a metaphor for dynamic change. And change itself is the nature of reality. He was opposed to observation as a method, the way the Milesian school applied it, because it does not teach understanding. Reality is a constant flux. How does this address the problem of change? Well, the basic idea is that for the Greeks, the problem was, well, how to explain the nature of things changing from one substance to another. And Heraclitus says your problem is you think of substances existing, then changing. And then there's substance and change. But thinking of these as separate is the problem. You need to think of change as the substance, as the fundamental thing. Heraclitus once wrote, "You never step in the same river twice." And metaphorically, you should understand that to mean that we are able to solve the problem of change by asserting that change actually doesn't occur in the way we think of it, from X changing into Y. You don't have X, you don't have Y. You just have change. You have constant dynamic movement. You have new configurations of things every moment. The universe is itself a state of flux. There are no things that turn into different things. There's just turning itself. So the world is a process. The world is not substances undergoing change. The world is change. This process, this fire, is everlasting, but never the same as it was before. So when you never step in the same river twice, what that means is, right, when you step in the river, take your toe, come back an hour later, the water is completely different. It's not the same water, it's not the same embankments, it's not the same fish in the water, it's a different thing. we perceive it as the same river, but that's an illusion, right? And reason shows to us that it's an illusion. In a way, you're quite wrong to think it's the same river. Reason will tell you of your error. Only untutored folk believe it's the same river, because everything constantly changes. In fact, it is the nature of things to be change. Not to change, but to be change. Right, don't think of fire as the underlying substance, the way Thales thought of water as a substance that could undergo change. Fire is an analogy for change itself. So here's some fragments of Heraclitus. I have in my philosophy book over here. So here's some selections. Right, it is not possible to step twice in the same river. This world order did none of gods or men make, but it was always but it always was and is and shall be an ever-living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. And of the logos, of reason, which is, as I describe it, men always prove to be uncomprehending. For although all things happen according to logos, men are like people of no experience. Right. So, right, everything changes. Right. This change has always existed and always will exist, and yet people don't understand reason, and as a result, don't understand this truth. So, again, only fragments of Heraclitus survive, but it tells us it's really an important departure from the Milesian school of philosophy, which was based on an observation. It was kind of proto-scientific, to a more rationalistic basis. And I'm going to kind of define rationalism and empiricism in a sec, because what Heraclitus is asking us to do is to disbelieve the evidence of our senses, to not believe the river is the same twice, to not believe our language which says, hey, that's the river Thames. Well, actually, it's not. It's a completely different river. To disbelieve the evidence of our senses and to use reason only. And Parmenides also asks us to do this. However, Parmenides' solution to the problem of change was not to say everything is changing ever, is to say nothing changes ever. So we have two really different extreme solutions to the problem of change, right? Why do things change? Because it is the nature of the universe to be change, Heraclitus says. Parmenides says, no, the solution to the problem of change is to realize nothing changes. All right, look, this is 540 BC, 2,500 years ago. People were just trying to do this, so they're, it's like that scene in The Matrix. Don't try to bend the spoon. There is no spoon. It's that kind of thing. So, change is an illusion. There's only the one. Right? Both are really opposite metaphysical solutions to the central problem of ancient Greek philosophy. But they share one thing in common, which is they ask us to disbelieve the evidence of our senses in favor of an argument based fully in abstract reasoning. Right? Change for Heraclitus, change is all there is. Or for Parmenides, change is an illusion. And you don't need an explanation, you just need to understand why it's an illusion. But in both cases, your senses are deceiving you, and reason will explain to you the real fundamental metaphysical, ontological nature of the universe. So, theories that conflict with observation and are the product of abstract reason, we're going to call these rationalistic theories. We're going to call the view that reason is superior to observation is more foundational rationalism. Thales was an empiricist. He believed in observation. He thought our senses are reliable guides to truth. He's an empiricist. Heraclitus and Parmenides are rationalists. Now, a lot of people in their essays end up writing things like, well, you need a little bit of both. Probably you need a little bit of both. But this is a question about what is foundational to knowledge with a capital K. How do you know things? For a rationalist, you need reason first. And anything given to you in sense experience is justified because we know our senses are justified through reason. Right? So reason justifies sense observation, not the other way around. For the empiricist, sensory observation is fundamental because reason can mislead us because it's too abstract. We need to be grounded back in our observations. So it's really about what is foundational to knowledge. So Heraclitus and Parmenides are It's a little anachronistic, but they're rationalists. They have theories that conflict with observation, and they're substituting abstract rational thought. All right, so why shouldn't we believe the evidence of our senses? Well, the ancient Greeks, many of them were very concerned with issues. Obviously, they didn't have this specific optical illusion, but they were very concerned with issues that might have arisen because of optical deception, visual deception, auditory deception. A lot of ancient authors talk about the fact that you put a stick in water, the stick appears bent, so how can you trust your senses? Right, if you have a cold hand and a warm hand, and you put it in the same temperature water, one water will feel warm, the other one will feel cold, right? So how can you trust your senses? This is a checker shadow illusion. I assure you, this gray and this gray are actually the exact same shade. Our brain reinterprets the image because of the shadow and the light to follow the pattern of squares, and is giving us information about the geometric square pattern while modifying slightly the hue of the gray. But if you put your hands on the screen and you just look at only those squares, I assure you they are the same color. Square A and B are the same shade, so you can't trust your senses. Or can you? Because we know they're the same shade, we know how to verify it, and we verify that empirically. So, how many dots are? It's another weird optical illusion. So, can we trust our senses? So Parmenides said no. We can't trust our senses. It looks like there's change. It looks like there's many things in the world, but in fact, the world metaphysically is a unified, unchanging, infinite oneness. It can't be subdivided, can't be modified. You feel like you are separate from that tree over there, but it's not. You're not separate from that tree. You are not separate from anything. The whole universe is just one unchanging, eternal, static substance. This appears to be wrong, but appearances deceive. So what's his reasoning here? All right. This is going to get a little abstract, so don't worry if you don't get it right away. Every time I reread the slide, I feel like I stop understanding it. So Parmenides argues that we can't think about what doesn't exist. Otherwise it would exist as a thought, right? So if I say something doesn't exist, in a way that's contradictory because I'm talking about something, so that doesn't exist. But it actually exists enough for me to point to it and say, this is the thing that doesn't exist. Real things, so what I mean when I say unicorns don't exist is because unicorns don't exist, right? So what am I talking about when I say unicorns don't exist? What I'm saying is a very limited thing. What I'm saying is limited to, can be translated to, unicorns exist in books and movies, but they are creations of human fiction by taking horses and horns and putting them together, but there are no examples of unicorns as living flesh and blood animals. That's what I mean by unicorns don't exist. But that is limited. If I really mean they don't exist, things that really don't exist can't even be thought of because their non-existence means that I can't point to it as the thing that doesn't exist. So, we cannot think about what doesn't exist. So, what exists cannot have come into being. What does exist can't have come into being. If this was so, it must have not existed at some point, which is inconceivable. That's impossible. Things can't have not existed at some point. And if what exists were to change, it must have become something other than what it is now, something it currently is not. But that's also inconceivable for the same reasons. So everything has always existed and it's never changed. Because things can't come into being from nothing. And to change is to become, right, something other than what it is, something it currently is not. Let me try this again, right? So what currently isn't can't ever be. What doesn't exist can't start to exist out of nothing. And what is cannot cease to exist, right? Change requires the ceasing and starting of things, which is impossible, right? Because we're not thinking of doesn't exist in the sense of a unicorn doesn't exist. We're thinking of not existing to the extent that I can't even point to it as a thing that doesn't exist. So change must be an illusion, right? What isn't, isn't. If it were something, it would be. But there's no nothing from which change can come, right? Because then the nothing would be something. It's the thing from which change comes. So there must be no real change. I know, okay, I know. Weed is legal now, so think about it. So a lot of people made fun of Parmenides for this stuff back in the day. Oddly enough, one of the greatest Socratic dialogues is the dialogue where Socrates meets Parmenides, written by Plato, of course, because Plato had tremendous respect for Parmenides, precisely because he was unafraid of letting his reason bring him to the conclusion, even though the conclusion seemed impossible. It's a very abstract argument, and Plato admired his commitment to that abstract argument. So when Socrates meets Parmenides, it's a really fascinating dialogue, because it's one of the few dialogues where Socrates appears to lose the argument. But we're going to get to that when we talk about Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and ancient Athens. Zeno was a student of Parmenides, and he's very famous for his paradoxes. And his paradoxes were designed to show that the doctrines of Parmenides were not as absurd as they seem. Parmenides had these really abstract arguments about, like, the nothing doesn't exist, and if nothing doesn't exist, then something can't come from nothing. Instead, he kind of gives these concrete arguments showing that the assumption of change leads to paradox. Change is more absurd than not change. This is kind of a classic reductio argument in philosophy. We say, let's say your argument is true. Suppose, for the sake of argument, if this were true, we get these contradictions. So what we've assumed must be false. So let's look at a couple of his paradoxes of motion. Right? There are more, but again, what's really interesting here is we're using abstract rational argument to derive conclusions which conflict with the senses. Right? The most well-known of Zeno's paradoxes, this one has been mathematically solved, thankfully, because of limits. So the most well-known of Zeno's paradoxes says that change must be an illusion, because before reaching any point, right? Suppose this hand is trying to get to that hand. Before this hand can move to that hand, it has to travel halfway. But if it has to travel halfway to this point here, it has to travel halfway to that halfway point, and to an eighth of that point, and to a 16th of that point. So if motion were possible, Zeno says, it should be possible to begin the sequence of motion here. But the sequence has no beginning. Therefore, motion is impossible. Right? Before I travel to the distance, I have to travel half that distance, and half the distance of the half, and half the distance of the half, and so on and so forth infinitely. So I never actually start moving, so motion has to be in some kind of illusion. Right? And if the sequence can't begin, it also can't end. If I reach halfway to the end, before I cross to the second half, I cross half of the second half, half of that part, so on, dap, dap, dap. So we have finite time to cross infinite distance. Thankfully, this one has been solved. But again, we're 2,500 years ago, and people are going like, what? Another paradox proposed by Zeno in support of Parmenides' view that change was impossible is that at any given instant of time, right? So if time, you could just, right, if time moves from one step to the next step, at any given step of time, all objects are motionless. Therefore, movement doesn't happen, since there's no interval of time at which things can be said to be moving. Right? So if movement doesn't exist at any step in time, right? Why can it's said to be exist at all of a sudden? Because we have a bunch of steps in time. If it doesn't exist right? It's a bit like saying, if there's no water in any given water bottle, why? And then I put all the water bottles next to each other, all of a sudden water exists? That doesn't make sense, guys. All right, so if movement doesn't exist at any step in time, movement doesn't exist at any step, right, at all. All right, here's a great video by one of my favorite YouTube channels, PHIl on math, about Zeno's paradoxes. I think you should watch them because they'll do, first of all, a better job talk about the mathematics of these arguments. But I just wanted to give them some philosophical context, right? How crucially important it was to take that step of, providing abstract logical arguments for conclusions, even if the conclusions were in a way absurd, just because it lays the groundwork for certain kind of mode of thinking. How are we doing for time here? Let me just look at my clock here. 21 minutes. Okay, moving on. So that was Heraclitus and Parmenides, both rationalists, both asking us to disregard the evidence of our senses in favor of abstract rational arguments. And again, that PHIl video does a really nice job with Zeno's paradoxes. Sophie's World also talks about Empedocles, 490, 430 BCE. He kind of returns to the kind of elemental hypotheses of the Milesian philosophers, more substance-based, more empirical. Really interesting guy. He says, look, there are 4 elements, and there are 2 fundamental forces. How many? Yeah, 4 elements, 2 forces, right? So, the 4 elements, right? Earth, air, fire, water. Everything changed the day Fire Nation attacked. That's Empedocles. Came up with that. And they're acted by love and strife, they're not literally acting on love. It's like, oh, water and fire hate each other. These are metaphors they're just words he's using to say, look, there's a principle of creation and there's a principle of destruction. So the idea that you have elements and you have forces, really, again, sophisticated proto-scientific thinking for Empedocles here. So we have this really interesting metaphysical picture getting more complicated. And why it's sophisticated and interesting is in part because we are starting to think of the natural world as comprised of distinct elements acted upon by law-like forces, which is, again, if you abstract away from the specifics, if you're not thinking about the specific elements and what the forces are, we have is basically a correct picture of the world. Because if you ask a physicist, can you explain change? They're going to start telling you about atoms and elements, and they're going to talk about forces like the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetism, right? So the names are wrong, and a lot more than the names are wrong, but the basic picture of substances and forces is kind of right. So Empedocles had a theory, says, look, the universe started out with the elements combined and inert. Strife began pulling them apart. Right, so kind of a Big Bang, resulting in the material world, which is an imbalance between the principle of creation and destruction, but eventually destruction will predominate, resulting in a chaotic universe, and the cycle will repeat itself. So again, we have really kind of interesting observations here by Empedocles, which you can reread to make sense in more modern physical terms. So strife will predominate for Empedocles in the long run in the universe. This is kind of right. Entropy, which is the state of things getting increasingly disordered, always increases in the universe. Entropy will always increase, and eventually the universe will run out of order and will just be chaos, right? All the stars will run out of fuel. Everything will decay to its most stable state, right? Why? Because it takes more energy to unscramble an egg, roughly. So disorder, in a closed system, disorder always increases. That's basic thermodynamics. And Empedocles said, yeah, the forces of strife will predominate, resulting in a fully chaotic universe. However, there's kind of a reset button. We're not sure how it works. And hopefully it does work. Empedocles, wow, I have so many slides on Empedocles. He was a really interesting guy. Anticipates evolution, right? So he doesn't have a theory for why organisms are spontaneously generated, but basically it's mutation. Some of these don't survive, some do survive, only the ones that are adapted to survival are left. Very interesting anticipation of evolution. Unfortunately, these ideas were basically untouched for 2,000 years. Also, probably the first theory of vision in this tradition that came out of ancient Greece. He thought light streamed out of our eyes to go and touch objects and bring them back to us. But hey, it's a guess. I think finally our last philosopher today of the pre-Socratics is Democritus. So Democritus kind of takes Empedocles and makes it even more abstract. So whereas Empedocles is like the elements are earth, air, fire, and water, which are kind of observable things, like here's an element right here. Democritus says, no, the nature of the basic elemental substances are unobservable. You need to cut them up until their smallest parts where they can't be cut anymore, which is what atomoi means in Greek, uncuttable. And then their nature is going to be distinct from the nature of any substance which we can observe with the naked eye, which is the unaided eye. And the reason substances like, more complex things like substances are the way they are is because of the way the atoms are combined in them. So an atom is the smallest thing you can't cut into smaller pieces, right? And each atom was eternal and can't be changed. The configuration of things in the world is explained by the combination of these atoms. So there's different types of atoms. Some of them, he said, might be hooked. Some of them might have like holes, so they get hooked into each other. And if you get a whole bunch of these together, it creates like a substance with specific properties. And that would explain change for Democritus. Atoms come together and then break apart again. And the nature of the atoms and their configuration determines the nature of the physical objects they create. So again, mind blown, 2,500 years ago, Democritus comes up with atomic theory. So there's different kinds of atoms, different shapes. Their combinations come together and cease to be, but the atoms themselves are eternal. This led Democritus to all kinds of pretty wild conclusions for the time. Democritus, for example, denied the immortality of the soul and claimed the mind was material because we ourselves are made up of atoms. And when this configuration of atoms falls apart, then all our properties go away as well, including our minds, because our minds are just configurations of atoms. Again, the very modern, very atheistic sounding views here. So for Democritus, this is from the book, right? Atoms and void are the only two realities, and all else was appearance. When atoms approach or collide or entangle, the aggregates appear as water, fire, plants, humans. But all that really exists are these underlying atoms, and the void, which is nothingness. The qualities perceived by the senses are appearances. Right? By convention, sweet, by convention, bitter, by convention, hot, cold, but in reality, atoms and void. Right? Does your computer really exist? Is this chair? Is this chair really real? Are there chairs? Really, it's just atoms. Chair is a convenience we created to think of specific configurations of atoms, but they're not really real. Really, there's just atoms and the void. Okay, so that's the last philosopher. Gardner asks us a question as he wraps up this section. Is a chapter titled Fate, and he poses 3 questions. Do you believe in fate? Is sickness punishment of the gods? What forces govern the course of history? 3 really kind of deep questions here. And they tie into problems surrounding free will, explanation, evil, destiny. And there is certainly this tendency of the human mind to look for certain kinds of explanations for events. Right? Is sickness the punishment of the gods? This seems crazy, but a lot of people do believe this, not just 2,000 years ago, but today, where you might, if there's a natural disaster, you want to find someone to blame, and you say, well, who's to blame? The furries. It's the furries. They go against God's will and we're being punished by it. So people still think that today. So Gardner is pointing to natural human tendencies to look for explanations of things. And I want to kind of talk about something called the just world fallacy or the just world hypothesis. There's a whole Wikipedia article on this. But this, to me, is just a fallacy. It's a cognitive bias. We tend to interpret people's situations as fundamental reflections of their actions or their character. Right? That a person's actions are inherently inclined to bring morally fair and fitting consequences to that person, so that good deeds are rewarded and evil deeds punished. And then we work backwards from that, right? So there's a cognitive bias towards assuming that if somebody has a bad outcome, they must have done something to deserve it necessarily. Sometimes it's true, but sometimes it's just not true. Sometimes good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people. So the just world hypothesis Gardner's talking about here in terms of fate or destiny is kind of morally alerting us to the fact that we have this cognitive bias towards believing that, when people go through misfortune, they must have done something to deserve it. And there's a lot of psychological studies on this, right? That, if people play a board game that's rigged so that some players start playing Monopoly with more money, the players that started with more money 100% believe that they won fairly, even though they started with more money. If you give people money randomly in a lottery, people will also believe that the people that got less money did something to deserve it. So a lot of psychology behind the just world hypothesis. Another experiment here, 1966, there was a series of experiments that used shock paradigms, this is awful, to investigate observer-response victimization. 72 subjects were made to watch a Confederate receiving electric shocks. Initially, subjects were upset, but as the suffering continued and observers remained unable to intervene, the longer it continued, the observers began to derogate the victim. And in other words, to start going like, well, that person's dumb anyway. To hell with them. Like, the more the suffering go on, the more the cognitive dissonance of watching a bad thing happen to a good person cause them to try and figure out that cognitive dissonance and find a reason for it. Okay. So you can kind of look at these slides on the just world fallacy. And it's really kind of important because as we move forward, we're going to be talking about political philosophy in the ancient Greek world, which justified morally atrocious institutions, sometimes on the basis of these kinds of ideas. Aristotle, for example, believes some people were natural slaves. So have a look at some of these slides as you're reading this fate chapter. I know it seems like a hard turn out of the philosophical stuff, but there's a reason Gardner is putting it there. All right, I'll see you guys next week. We're going to be talking about Socrates and Plato. I think we have a quiz coming up, so let me just click here. Yeah, quiz 1, May 17th, so it's going to open really soon. It's going to be open until May 28th, so you have a lot of time to write it. Might have to clean up these times here, 12:27 a.m., that makes no sense. All right, let me clean that up. Otherwise, I hope this was useful, and I will see you guys next week.